the journey or the recovery journey isn't about becoming something or adding things onto us to become something. Maybe it's about removing and taking the things off that we've put on ourselves or that society's put on us and finding out who we were in the beginning. And I really love that because I think that's true. I do think, that society and our parents and our schools and our peers and everything, put all this stuff on top of us until we've lost our identity and we don't know who we are anymore.
Welcome to Heart of Change podcast, where we explore heroic and inspiring stories of change. In today's episode, I'm honored to be joined by Stu Fenton, a seasoned psychotherapist with 18 years of experience in alcohol and drug recovery, working within the LGBTQ+ community. Stu is from Australia and living in Berlin. He has a deep experience with Gestalt psychotherapy, mental health, and addiction counseling. Previously, Stu was the program director for the Cabin Chiang Mai. His passion lies in guiding individuals grappling with addiction, be it substances or various process addictions like sex or workaholism, and bringing those in need towards a transformational change. Stu's therapeutic approach is a rich blend of psychodynamic interventions, cognitive behavioral therapy, and pragmatic skill building aimed at nurturing awareness, healing impulses, and fostering new behaviors. Today, we dive into the important topic of addiction, exploring the nuances of overcoming addiction and the growth that comes with recovery. I look forward to connecting with Stu on the topic of addiction, a huge life change that affects so many. Stu, thank you so much for sitting down with me today. A fellow addict and someone who has battled with addiction a couple times in her life, I really wanted to touch base on this subject. I think so many people are affected by addiction. It's a huge life change, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about addiction and through your work today. We were discussing the cycle of change when we were tapping into your personal story. Can you expand on what the cycle of change is?
Yeah, so the cycle of change was a model created by Prochaska and De Clementis, and it was made to support and help people who were trying to give up smoking. And basically what it says is that when a person before they start realizing they have a problem, they're in a place which is called pre-contemplation. They're not contemplating changing at all. Following that comes contemplation. That's when a person goes, okay, I'm sick of smoking. I hate the smell of my breath, like all the negative things. And then they start to contemplate change. And then the next stage on from that is the action phase. So then they move from, okay, I've thought about this enough and now I know I definitely want to do something. So they move into action, which could be seeing their doctor, getting tips on how to stop smoking, reading the Alan Carr book, there's so many.
I read that book.
Good. But the action phase is where you're actually actively doing something to make the change come about. And then from there, once you're in action, in that sense, you would stop smoking. And then as the cycle goes around, you either stay in maintenance, which means you no longer smoke, or you relapse, which means you have a slip up, or you might even return to smoking on a regular basis. But then you have the chance to start again, go from, pre-contemplation to contemplation to action again. And this model gets used a lot in treatment facilities because you can basically apply it to any addiction pretty much. So it works very well for chemical addiction and process addictions as well. And I use it a lot in the work that I do when I'm working with people wanting to recover, because I have to always get a sense of, is this person in contemplation or action? Where are they? Because, for example, I have a client at the moment who is talking about the fact that they have a drug problem, but they're nowhere near actively doing something about it, and that can be a very difficult place to try and work with a client when they're not doing something. Whereas, I have other clients at the moment who are in the action phase, and they're going to, recovery conventions across the other side of the world, and they've got a sponsor, and they're doing 12-step meetings every day, and they've booked in to go to rehab if this doesn't work. Like, they're structuring lots of action steps around what they are doing to achieve the outcome, which is to get sober.
That's great. And this is a cycle that you actually went through yourself in your journey of change.
Yeah. So like for me, I got sober 21 years ago, and I spent nearly a year in long-term, short-term rehab in Australia in 2003. And I was experiencing a lot of drug-induced psychosis. And that's what kind of was my motivation to step into action. And when I went to, once I came out of that therapeutic community, I just maintained my recovery by 12-step meetings, by giving back to the community, volunteering, sponsoring other people who were trying to get sober, and maintained that recovery for 16 years. I became a psychotherapist. I started working in drug rehabs. I started managing and team leading in drug rehabs. But at the 16-year mark, I stopped doing quite a few of those things. In a way, I kind of felt like, oh, I'm fine now. I've been sober 16 years. Everything's good. But what happened was I came to Berlin. I was going to conferences that were about controlled consumption and harm reduction, which is when you try to moderate your use. And I think I became a little bit kind of hypnotized by that and started to wonder, oh, did I give controlled consumption a good enough go 16 years ago? Maybe there's a way I can achieve this. And so I gave it a go, but like it became very clear to me within 2 to 3 months that I was not able to moderate my use or practice controlled consumption. And so that was my relapse, because as you remember when I told you about the cycle, I was in maintenance for 16 years. And then, because it's funny, I always used to think, oh, it's weird that they have relapse on this, but it seems a bit negative. Why don't we just stay in maintenance? And then when I relapsed, I went, oh, now I see why they have this, because the model then says you can stay in relapse or you can come back into the cycle and get sober again, which is what I did. I went to LA, I lived with my sponsor, I went to 12-step meetings, and I got sober again. And I've been sober ever since 4.5 years again now.
Wow. So I feel like you can't really dial it back when you go to a certain place with addiction, and then I would just end up back in the state I was in previously. Is that sort of your take on it as a psychotherapist, or what are your thoughts?
I'm not saying that is the case for everyone, but it was definitely for me. We also use a term, especially in alcohol and other drug terminology, which is a slip, a lapse, and a relapse. So a slip is like when you just have a sip of wine or a glass of wine, or maybe you just have a couple of tokes on some marijuana. A lapse is maybe you go back to 3, 4, 5 days or a week of using, but then you get back on track again. And then a relapse is a return to all your old behaviors, weekend after weekend or week after week. So in my situation, I initially had I would say I had a lapse, because I came to Berlin and I think I used for 3 or 4 days, then didn't for 4 days, then used for another weekend. And then I was living in Thailand. I went back to Thailand and thought, you know what? That was kind of fun, but I don't think I want to do that anymore. But what happened was, over the next 5 months, with a 2-month break in between, I used again. But every time I used, it got worse. Like, it went back to how I hated life when I was trapped right in addiction. I was hanging around with people I didn't want to hang around with. I was having these dreadful 5-6 day come downs after a big weekend. I was, staying up for days on end. And by the 4th time that I went on a bender, I just realized I was in relapse. I was back to my old life and I didn't want it. So that's why I chose to change.
Yeah. I always sort of looked at addiction as you enter into drug usage for freedom, but then you are robbed of your freedom in the end, right? You end up imprisoned by the exact thing that you went to for freedom.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting point you make, and in the 12-step program they have what are they called? The 10 paradoxes of addiction or using or recovery, and that is, I think, one of them. The thing that initially gives us all this freedom and that we feel empowers us eventually takes away our freedom and our power, and but of course in the beginning you only kind of relish the freedom and the power. Like I spent maybe 10 years enjoying that, but there is a point where it does backfire. But, to be honest and fair, it doesn't backfire on everyone. There's still people from when I was using 20 years ago happily out there in the nightclubs using these days or using every now and then. So, that's why I think it's important to, in some ways, self-diagnose. I can say that I'm an addict, but I can't necessarily say that you are.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, or correct me if I'm wrong, but like what causes is addiction is a little bit different for each person too. And I'm curious your thoughts on that. We did discuss Gabor Mate when we were on the phone. We're both really big fans of him. And for those that don't know, Gabor Mate is a Canadian physician. He specializes in childhood trauma and pain and addiction. And his sort of line of thinking is that it's all based on childhood trauma. But I'd love to get your thought on what are the root causes of addiction?
Yeah, I would say this is the question I get asked the most, and I think probably anyone on a podcast gets asked this question. It'd be great to know the answer. I mean, I think, I tell you what makes it really tricky to answer this question. I've worked, for example, with a family 5-6 years ago, and they had 2 daughters. One daughter was a heroin addict, very extreme, and had been through treatment multiple times and seemed basically unhelpable. The second daughter was a perfect prefect daughter, A grades at school, ended up getting married, having children. Like, they were chalk and cheese, but they both got the same parenting. So, but at the same time, from a lot of people that I've talked to and different experiences I've had, I think it also depends on a lot of factors in the family too. Like with that example I just gave you, the first girl was gay, the second one was heterosexual. That can have an impact on a child. The messages they hear from society, from the parents talking about homosexuality as they grow up, and the impact on their self-esteem. Mm-hmm. And I think also the relationship between the parents at the time one child is born to another one. And I can give you an example. I'm working with a client overseas at the moment whose older sister was born at a time where the father was away working for long periods of time, not there for the mother, and the mother was very depressed and unhappy. When he was born 7 years later, the husband had come home, the marriage was in a happier place, the mother was happy, and, the mother even used to say later in life, this was the happiest time of my life. So, different circumstances when a child is in their formative years have different impacts. The thing that I like what Gabor Mate says is, I hope I'm quoting this as correctly as possible, but that a lot of his belief is that addiction comes from stressed parenting, and that would fit with the examples that I'm just giving. So I think, there's a lot of people think it's genetic in some sort of way. I'm not sure I believe that. I do think it's environmental. I think a lot of it is how we're parented growing up. I think it has to do with who we are as we grow up in that family, like the messages that we hear, what happens to us at school. So, if I had to put my money on it, I would say it's more environmental than genetic.
Yeah. And Gabor Mate, I believe I watched a clip on him where he said that we tend to just sort of shut down or zone out. For instance, a baby can't really get away from stress when there's like a stressful parent or stressful situation. So they try to block it out. And as children, we block things out or we try to push away from that.
Yes.
And that's a tactic as well.
Well, what you're talking about fits very much with the models that I use when I'm working with clients, especially Gestalt therapy, because Gestalt therapy has a concept that called creative adjustment or creative adaptation, which means that when a child is growing up in a family and something stressful is happening to them, they have to find a way to cope with it. And there are, as you can imagine, many situations that a child wouldn't know how to cope with. For example, parents yelling at each other on a daily basis. Like, there's no mini counselor in the house coming up to the child and saying, oh, like, now's a good time for you to go to the bedroom and shut the door and not listen to this. Or, you know, mum and dad are fighting because they have financial problems and this is nothing to do with you. So the child has to make up their, you know, like, will make up lots of different stories. They're fighting because of me. I'm the problem, or many different stories. So a child creatively adjusts to that situation. So it could be that they start to addictively watch television. I'm giving my age now because I'm from the 70s, but these days probably gaming would be a way to disassociate or distract from a distressing situation where the parents are fighting, or the child could start, you know, eating lots of candy and chocolate and stuff to get that sugar dopamine hit, which takes them away from the stress and are mum and dad going to break up or whatever. And, you know, you can, you know, as they get older, then they turn to masturbation or they turn to watching porn today with the internet. Like, there's so many ways that small children creatively adapt to stressful situations within their family system. So, you know, ultimately turning to alcohol, turning to drugs is a creative adaptation of sorts, or a coping mechanism. And, you know, I guess the lucky part of my story is that, you know, as a therapist, I'm able to reflect on my own lived experience of this as well. So when I ended up in rehab, I was like, oh, I see, you know, like, I never got enough attention from my dad and enough intimacy and enough love and support from him. And I think that's why, because one of my other primary addictions is love addiction. So I tend to go after men that are like my father, very unavailable and avoidant. So that's a creative adjustment of sorts. Or, you know, like reflecting on my own lived experience, when I was in rehab, I'd be thinking, oh, okay, and I don't feel masculine enough, you know, to attract the kind of men that I want. So then I have to take steroids or go to the gym more to look a particular kind of way. Or, you know, because I was quite effeminate growing up, you know, taking steroids and building my body in a certain way was actually a creative adjustment to camouflage myself, so that I know everyone just looked at me and assumed that I was heterosexual and didn't, you know, yell homophobic slurs at me. So it worked in a way, but then, you know, for example, with addiction, it ends up backfiring in the long run.
Yeah. So Gestalt, I know it's a German word and it means like pattern or shape, I believe. What is sort of the core definition of Gestalt therapy?
I mean, great question. I think it's been great for me living in Germany because it was always a word I couldn't pin down when I was living in Australia, and seeing it in context here in Germany in different sentences. You know, I actually use the word design, which is very similar to what you said, the pattern or the design. And in a nutshell, people would describe Gestalt as being a much more humanistic and relational therapy. So, you know, my first therapist was a psychiatrist, very much blank screen, never disclosed anything about themselves. I would sit there to tell them about myself, and, you know, they would reframe things and reflect it back to me in a very dry kind of way. I learned a lot that way, but it was not relational at all. I would say Gestalt is very relational. You build a relationship with the client where the therapist will self-disclose at times. I'm not saying over-disclose, but like, you know, even small things like the person sitting there might just talk about something terrible that happened to them, and the Gestalt therapist can show their compassion and their empathy and their concern for that person quite unrestrained. I don't mean like too much, but just so that the client feels heard and understood and seen. And this is because that's very, very healing. So there's three terms in Gestalt that they use. One is experiment, one is dialogical relationship, and the other one is phenomenology. Phenomenology is when let's say you're my client, when you're sitting there, I'm noticing the phenomena of you in front of me for the entire hour we're there. So if you're a very common one in a session is when, I don't know if you can see on the camera, but if a client is flicking their fingers like this, a Gestalt therapist might say, what's happening there with your hand right now? Or can you exaggerate that and make it bigger? And what does it bring out in you? So that's like an extension of the energy that we have inside of ourselves. Phenomenology can also be the way that a client uses words. They might use quite harsh words like slam and punch and attack, and I can sit there and go, wow, look at these. This is interesting, this pattern of words, the way they design these words that come together. What does this say about them? Even the way they sit in the chair, I have some clients come in and they sit there like that. And I think, what does this tell me about them? And, another client might come in and be like really attentive. And, there's a term in Gestalt which is said, how does the client body forth in the world? That means, how do they move and where does that movement come from? I think experiment is one of the other ones. It's the one I love the most. That means, I don't know if you've heard of chair work, but in Gestalt we always have two chairs, one for the client and one for the chair work, and me sitting here. And so I might ask the client to talk to their deceased parent, and tell them, what they never got the chance to tell them when they were alive. They might talk to their boss, or they might talk to their partner, or sometimes we'll do something called top dog, underdog, which is where you have two parts of yourself that are in conflict, and you begin a dialogue between those two parts of you to try and find out why is one part resisting the other one. So experiment can take many different possible formats. And the last part is dialogical relationship. And it's a little bit like I was saying to you before. What happens, I can sit here with a client and go, wow, they're not giving me anything today. I feel like I'm doing all the work. And so then I'm trying to understand or I might even ask them, what does this feel like to you, this dialogue? I wouldn't say dialogical because most of the time they wouldn't understand that, but this energy between us, or this relationship between us. Or, sometimes I can have a client where I'm sitting here and they're talking nearly the whole hour without me having to say something. I'm like, wow, what is this energy coming out of them? What does this say about them? What is it that they need right in this moment? And there's many things I could tell you about Gestalt. That's the basic one, but probably on top of all that, it's about the here and now. It's not about going back into the past and looking what happened with mum and dad. It's about, what are you feeling in your body right now? What's happening in terms of your thinking, and trying to work with what is right now.
Interesting. I think a lot of people that are in conflict, they do have kind of two sides to them. I think even when people are in the throes of addiction, sometimes there's this awareness outside of themselves where they're fully aware that they are in this addiction state. Do you work with addicts that are in this kind of dual or this polarity of states and sort of try to bring out that other part of them? Or what are your thoughts on sort of the polarity of self with addiction?
Are you talking about the shadow side, or
sort of in that vein? Yeah, in that line.
I guess what I'm often thinking is, what is driving the addiction? What is the need that's trying to be met? Because I also work from a different model, which is called the post-induction treatment model. Mm-hmm. And in that model, we see that the use of drugs or alcohol or any addiction is actually the solution. Most people will come and say it's the problem. Or if the parent brings their addicted son or daughter, they say the problem is they're using drugs. I would say the solution is they're using drugs. What is the problem that is making them turn to drugs and alcohol? So in that model, we go back to the beginning, and this is very much about family of origin and saying what happened with their sense of value and their self-esteem as they were growing up. What happened with their vulnerability? Was it respected and validated? So what happened to their boundaries? Do they have sloppy boundaries, or do they have walls? Neither are healthy. And we try to create healthy boundaries. We're also talking about something called reality, which is, can the person share their reality and be completely authentic? Because we often don't want to show the world our true self, because we'll be rejected or shamed, or we might be unlovable. So we're working with, if someone's not able to be authentic in the room, why not? And what does it mean if, because a lot of people are shamed when they grow up. You're not allowed to be angry, or big boys don't cry, all this kind of thing. And then the next one is about self-care. So some people grow up either not looking after themselves at all and sort of being bad and rebellious, or being absolutely good and perfect. And, that was my story. I was good and perfect. And then when I found drugs, I was able to unleash the shadow side of myself, the bad boy. But I couldn't do that without drugs, and that's because the energy in me wanted to balance itself up, and when I say bad, I'm not saying like doing really bad things, just being able to have crazy sex or fun sex, or be able that without
you would
shame.
Never have done if you were sober.
I definitely would.
I can relate with that.
Yeah, I would have found it. I did find it a lot harder, and it was so liberating to take drugs and then go, oh, look what I can do. I can do this and I can do that, and it feels great.
Right. It's such a fake sense of confidence, though. It gives you the confidence to go do things, but to be really confident, you do them sober.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think something that I've learned is that I believe that a lot of the reasons people take drugs is that, they're using drugs to be able to do those things. But I think the journey of recovery is the really scary but rewarding thing, is learning how to do those things without drugs. Like, how do I have crazy and exciting sex without drugs? Which is something that I discovered I could do, but it took me a long time to get the courage to do that. And drugs are just a shortcut to that, because, yes, you can take drugs and do that, but there's always a payoff, a negative pay. Well, maybe not for everyone. There was for me a negative payoff, like then I have a come down for 5 days where I feel terrible, or I get an STI or contract HIV, or end up embarrassing myself in some way. Like drugs are very risky in that regard. Whereas what I found in recovery, if we're talking about sex, is I have, total control over how I am sexually. And because over 20 years I've taken more and more risks and learned how to do stuff, I can have that fun out of control sex, but not in a way that puts me in danger or has me feeling kind of out of control or ashamed of my behavior.
Well, I heard this explained before, and I sort of resonated with me, is that when you do drugs, you get this immediate rush, and you're sort of addicted to that high, that risk factor. And when you're sober, the reward is it's more flatlined, but sort of the overall bar comes up in your life. Do you know what I'm saying? You don't get the immediate highs as much, but overall, it's feels better.
Yeah. This is a very common concept that counselors will talk to service users in treatment facilities about. And I remember when it was first explained to me, I was kind of like, it's a funny concept to listen to, because I am very familiar with the highs, but I hated the lows, where I would be suicidal and terrible on Tuesday and Wednesday when I had no dopamine left in my body. And so that's what my life was like for about 6 years. When I was in the worst of my addiction, it was just super, super high and exhilarating. It was almost like, being bipolar. And then, for 4 or 5 days, you're completely low, no dopamine, feeling like you want to die, terrible. And then you feel good again. And then 2 weeks later, you're really high again. And that's what it's like. Whereas what I've found in recovery, as you said, it's kind of like little highs, little lows, but it's all manageable, A high these days is like, oh, I'm going out to see Dune with my 2 best friends on Friday night, and then we're going to go for a burger. It's not like intravenously using crystal meth by any means, but that comes at a huge cost. Going on a holiday for me is like a big, when I say it's a really nice high as well. So that's what life becomes, is those kind of highs. And the good thing is the lows are never catastrophically low. And it's just about adjusting to that new way of
living,
exactly,
which is actually the normal way of living.
Which most non-addicts do every day. That's how they live. It's like
overall, and it takes time in sobriety, I think, where you hit a point and you realize that slow dripping, that dopamine has its benefits.
Yes.
But of course, the addict in you, the addict in me is like, I want that initial hit. We all want that initial quick high. We don't want to be patient for anything or like give it time.
Yeah, I mean, this is what you're talking about now is a very, and I try to talk very technically about drugs, so it's nothing is triggering for people. But I do remember the first time I intravenously used crystal meth, and it notoriously releases a huge amount of dopamine into your system in seconds, much more than any other drug, even cocaine or anything else. And I remember the first time I did that, the sensation was like nothing I've ever experienced before. And it was exhilarating, and it lasted, like 2 days after that. But, also the downside of that was just feeling treacherous and horrible and like death for like 5 or 6 days. Yeah. So, yeah.
It's like the scales aren't balanced. So what you pay for that high, and it tends to be more and more and more. So in my youth, I was addicted to drugs. Sort of, I want to say came out of it, but aren't we all kind of addicted to things in some way? I was in a gray area for a long time and then fell back into addiction a second time. And when I say that in a way that is very pronounced. And I think that, I thought, I've gotten out of it before, I can get out of it again. And that was a big lesson, is that it gets worse, I think, with time. And I wanted to get your perspective on that as well, because I think that we think we know our relationship with these substances, but that even our relationship with these substances can change over time.
Yeah. I mean, I told you before I had a relapse at 16 years, and I was quite shocked how quickly I went back to where I had been before. And I wouldn't say necessarily got worse, but I think if I had continued, it would have got worse. And, I don't understand the mystery of addiction in that regard, but it was definitely true that after 16 years of having a fantastic life, building a career, building friendships, repairing my relationship with my parents, like the list goes on. And then I used drugs one time and suddenly I felt awful, and, all the things that I hated, like, strangers coming back to my hotel room that I didn't want to be there, and, dishonest people coming into my life. And, I remember one guy coming back to my room, invited back for an hour and didn't leave for 3 days, and I couldn't ask him to leave, and I don't know why. And I mean, I do now because I was on drugs, but like normally these days, if someone's in my space and I don't want them there, I'll say, hey, I need you to leave in the next half hour because I've got stuff to do. But drugs would take away all my capacity to communicate. Yeah, sensibility, to communicate, to have boundaries, to, have healthy self-esteem, everything it took away.
Yeah. And I know, at least from my personal experience and just from the things that I've studied, that people that are addicted to drugs are in a lot of pain. And I want to get your perspective on being addicted to pain and staying in pain.
Do you mean that you think some people are unconsciously addicted to pain?
I think some people consciously and some people unconsciously are addicted to pain.
Oh, I don't know if I can comment on this.
I'm not a licensed professional.
No,
this is just a thought.
I mean, look, I've not come into contact with this. The only way that I could probably answer that question is sometimes I do think people become very accustomed to, for example, maybe being a victim or playing a victim role, which is very painful in a way. So I'm not talking about physical pain, and I'm not sure if you are either, but definitely emotional pain. I do think sometimes people become very accustomed to being there. It's very familiar to them. And, it is, I think that familiarity, it's a bit like the saying, better the devil you know. I think some people have spent so much of their lives in pain of some sort and they know it so well that they don't want to take the risk of letting go to try something new. And in fact, something that is relative to this was I was working with a girl with an eating disorder in a treatment facility a while ago, and I didn't know a lot about eating disorders, and I normally leave that up to more specialized people. But when I was working with her, she did introduce me to a piece of literature that I thought made a lot of sense to me. A lot of people with eating disorders, the metaphor is that they're floating down a river clinging onto a log, and the log is their eating disorder, right? And, the people on the side of the river are saying, let go of the log and just swim to the side and you'll be safe. That's like when people, hear of someone who's binging and purging, throwing up in the shower on a daily basis, and it's very aware to everyone else. That's like everyone saying, but can't you see this is really dysfunctional and you're hurting yourself and you're going to, damage your esophagus and whatever. But unless that person clinging onto the log, which is the eating disorder, is the thing that's keeping them alive. That's why they're clinging onto it. And it has a whole, and I mean, you can use that same metaphor for addiction, definitely as well. But so you have to work with that person very gently and slowly to get them to understand that there is a way of swimming to the side of the river where people can help them. But you can't just because we can see that the eating disorder is bad for them, yelling at them, let go of the log, is almost it is insane to the person with the eating disorder.
Yeah. I think also it's their painkiller. And it's like where, and I think Gabor Mate mentioned this, it's what kind of pain do you want to be in? Do you want to be in the pain of letting go of that log and then facing yourself? Or do you want to be in the pain of addiction?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's exactly why the person isn't letting go, isn't it? Because they don't know that the pain of swimming to the side or the unknown is going to be less or more painful than where they already are. And that's, and I would say that is absolutely the same with addiction because, for me, for example, I just thought, who am I if I don't use drugs as a gay man on the gay scene? Everyone's doing drugs. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't keep doing that. It was life-threatening. So I remember literally thinking, well, I'm going to walk into the unknown and hope that there's something better there. And thank God there was.
Right. It's how do you have the right tools in place and support, like having a psychotherapist or whatever it is to kind of guide you out. Because I honestly think, okay, here are your options. If you stay in pain in the addiction, that it's a continuous cycle of the same thing. But the unknown is healing yourself and going through that sort of that process. And what I can say just from my experience is it's a sacrifice. There's sacrifices in everything in life. But one thing that I will not sacrifice again in my life is sleep. And you don't realize when you are sleep deprived and you are in that psychotic cycle, you don't even realize how awesome sleep is. But it's such a beautiful thing. But it's the little things you start to gain back, and it's really interesting because you're really just changing back to your natural state.
Yes. Physically, definitely, it's a return to the natural state. I mean, I have a favorite recovery saying, which I can never quote properly. I should learn it better. But it basically says maybe the journey or the recovery journey isn't about becoming something or adding things onto us to become something. Maybe it's about removing and taking the things off that we've put on ourselves or that society's put on us and finding out who we were in the beginning. And I really love that because I think that's true. I do think, that society and our parents and our schools and our peers and everything, put all this stuff on top of us until we've lost our identity and we don't know who we are anymore.
Yeah. But don't you think sometimes people use drugs because they want to break out of all of that oppression. They maybe on a psychic level or in some way that they've had so much put on them from their parents, from their communities and their peers that really is unhealthy and has smothered them in terms of their pure self. So they start to use to sort of push out of that only to come back to their core. So then it almost gets to a broader question of the community. Like how healthy are we? And this could be another podcast, but how healthy are our communities around us?
Yeah, I mean, look, I do think Western society is very unhealthy, to be honest. And, coming here to Berlin to study social work and, coming from Australia, which is probably the top 10 privileged countries in the world to live, and being with classmates from India and Afghanistan and hearing what life is like for them, what they've grown up with. Like our definitely Western society is, I think, quite unwell and, very commercialized and so much focused on having to achieve and buy things. And if I don't have this, it means that. And, one of the gifts that I got from, I think, getting sober was I just lost interest in clothing brands and I just want to wear stuff that's comfortable. And, the other thing is I just don't need a lot of clothes. And I love that part of me now, whereas before it was like, oh, I need to have this because my friends have this and I need to be seen with this cap or those sunglasses or whatever. And, this I think we take for granted as being like, you see it on TikTok and Instagram and everywhere. And sometimes I look at it and go, that is sick. I think that's sick, especially when, there are so many, what's happening, with war at the moment. And, we were talking earlier about all the animals that are, you were talking about cat videos. I watched dog rescue videos from Thailand. Like the amount of why is this happening? That there's so many animals that are in so much pain, not just dogs, cats, everything, And here's society driving around in fast cars and nice clothes and whatever. But anyway, you're right. It's another podcast.
I totally understand. I think some of that is a rite of passage. And like I said, we're just raised with programming. We're young. We haven't really figured out the golden truth, right? And I think some of that is that cycle of breaking free and finding yourself. It's, I wouldn't want to go back to the state I was in personally, but I'm also grateful for that journey. And I think that there can be a lot of wisdom found in the pains of your journey, and they can create a lot of gratitude and peace as well.
Well, one of the other concepts that I use and a few of my colleagues use is the hero's journey.
Yes, I love it.
And I'm not sure if you've read Paulo Coelho's book.
The Alchemist.
The Alchemist,
yes, I love it.
And I think these were two concepts that really helped me in the journey, because I started to read quite a few stories about rites of passage and, Anne Frank, for example, and, all these stories of people. And you do see that similar trajectory that people take. And when I applied that to my journey, I was like, wow, yeah, there was a hero's journey there to getting to where I am now. And I think everyone in more or less some sort of way is faced with a hero's journey of some sort.
Right. And I think we're all on a hero's journey. I think that it's when we look at just communities, especially these communities that are infiltrated with a lot of drug usage, like you and I were both in the club scene, and we understand how that goes. And I think what I notice is that, yes, there are people that are in pain. Not everybody's at a different place, and we know that. But I think the underbelly of these communities does have a lot of pain, and it carries a lot of addiction with it. And what I notice is that there's just a lack of self-awareness of that pain and a lack of basic kindness. How do we navigate being in these communities that are heavily addicted and have sort of this underbelly of pain, but keep this growth mindset, this hero's journey, this we're going to evolve out of this. This is a catalyst for something anew to form.
Yeah, I think that's a really big question. There's quite a well-known I guess he was a frontline healthcare worker in the UK. He died during the pandemic, called David Stewart, and he put out a couple of podcasts and YouTube clips about gay men being kinder to each other. And, because he would witness the way that, for example, gay men would communicate with each other on dating apps was quite racist, quite unkind and cruel. People are just objectifying one another. And, I think that is a problem. And, how do you combat that? Well, I kind of feel like it has to begin with the individual, us becoming first aware of how we engage with other people and how we speak and communicate to them is really important. And what I see in Berlin too, because I work with a number of healthcare organizations like Manometer and Checkpoint and Schulenberatung, etc. And, you know, they all, I think, in their, what I think that I see in the way they operate is they have a policy of respect and care. And I mean, most health care organizations I've worked for, even in Australia, will have, you know, their set of 8 basic principles that they operate by. At least, you know, that is one way that you would hope any organization, you know, works with their clients. But then again, I come from mainly drug rehabs and community health organizations and stuff. I don't know if, you know, like IT organizations or startups in any format have those 8 principles, you know. I don't know if they're just focused on making money and success principles as opposed to kindness and respect. I don't know, but I do think it's got to start with the individual, and then in the organizations and the way that they foster how their workers and the whole organization works with other people.
Right. I think if we sit in pain too long, it's at our detriment. It's at our demise.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
I do. And, you know, again, I was talking about this model that I work from, the post-induction treatment model, and the woman who created that, Pia Melody, she has one particular diagram which has and I always wish at moments like this I had it with me, but basically she has about 8 core feelings, and she has what is the extreme version of this when it's not helpful, and with this feeling, what is it pain, for example, what is it useful for? So pain in its most extreme version can be like paralysis, or I think it's hysteria or something. You know, if anyone is in that great a pain, it becomes completely unproductive. But if you tap into a feeling like pain for what it is supposed to be for, you go, oh, it's to help me change. It's to help me learn. It's to help me grow. It's to help me become aware. So, you know, that's how I try to operate as a result of me studying this stuff, is like when I'm having a feeling, what I used to do, you know, before I got into recovery and studied this stuff is I would be debilitated by a feeling. If I was in pain, I'd be paralyzed and I would be just hiding under the doona. These days I go, okay, I'm in pain. What is behind the pain? I'm feeling pain because I've been rejected in a relationship and it hurts, and I'm feeling there's grief there as well. Pain and grief. Okay, what do I need to do here? I need to love myself. I need to tell myself I'm lovable. I need to get out and get a massage.
Give yourself a hug.
Yeah, self-care, anything. I need to hang with other people. I need to whatever, you know, so that if you tap into the feeling for the right reason, you can do a lot with it in a productive way. But I think a lot of the world is very unconscious about why we have feelings. And so, you know, they feel pain and they go, I've got to go out and get totally smashed on alcohol and take drugs so I don't feel this feeling. That's what I did, and that's how I ended up in recovery, because the problem is if you deal with it that way, the feeling stays in your body. It doesn't, the energy of that feeling never leaves your body. It's just there. So like, that's why I was stuck in addiction for 6 years. I had all these unprocessed feelings that I was medicating and band-aiding with drugs. And then when I got to rehab, I'm laughing because it's all over now, but I spent about 10 years with all those feelings that I hadn't felt for 6 years or my whole lifetime slowly coming out. I'd sit in therapy sometimes crying, not knowing why I was crying.
Right. I completely understand. But I think it's the becoming process is you sort of know when you're ready to come out of addiction, you go, okay, I want to be here, but you have to be aware that it's a process, like that there's going to be some pain and some healing and a lot of therapy that needs to take place. But I think when you're sitting in that state, a lot of people they're so high or they're so addicted to drugs that they can't really slow down enough to have that kind of conversation. And that's the community that's like perpetuating the hate and the bullying and the self-loathing. And I think, to that community that's not ready to really face their addiction, because you can't really tell someone to face an addiction. They have to come to that realization in themselves. I think just creating a little bit of awareness, just even the tiniest bit of awareness of your own addiction when you're in that state, if you can hang on to that. And like you said, the hero's journey sort of like follow that journey. When the timing is right, when you're ready to hear that message, it'll be there. Just even the smallest awareness, I think, is important.
Yep.
That's great. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation today. It's been such a meaningful conversation for me as someone who's also been on this journey, and to collaborate with you to share our insights about addiction has been really wonderful. So thank you again, Stu.
And likewise, thank you for the opportunity.
All right. If you liked my conversation with Stu today as much as I did, please be sure to like and subscribe. We'll definitely dive into some important topics around change.